Hello and welcome to our second video. This one's going to be a brief introduction to chemistry. If you need help going over some of the terms you're going to see in this video, I would suggest going back and rewatching the chemistry review one, which will give you a good overview of some vocabulary and how we draw atoms. So, you might be thinking to yourself, this is a biology class, why am I watching a bunch of videos on chemistry? In reality, what we're actually doing is we are learning about biochemistry. We know the prefix bio means life, and chemistry is the study of matter. Matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. Anything that is living is going to be composed of matter because it does have mass and take up space. So therefore, biochemistry, and the kind of chemistry we'll be talking about in this class, is the study of matter that is also living. Of course, there's non-living matter as well. So this is an overview of our agenda for today. The first thing we're going to be talking about is carbon structure. One of the major themes of this entire year will be the relationship between structure and function. One cannot work without the other. How something looks and what it can do are very closely linked. The second thing we'll be talking about is the octet rule, which is an important rule for when we get into bonding, which are our third and fourth topic. We'll be talking about covalent bonds and ionic bonds. There's a third type of bond that we will be talking about in this class, and that is hydrogen bonds, but it is not for this video. So first we have our structure of carbon. Carbon is a relatively small atom. It has 6 protons, 6 neutrons, 6 electrons. It has a little chart down here for you to look at. So the electrons are shown in green right here with a negative charge. We have our protons in blue with a positive charge, and the last one are our neutrons in red with a neutral charge. A neutron is made up of 1 proton and 1 electron. Those two charges are going to cancel each other out, which is how we get our neutral charge. Proton is easy to remember because proton and positive both begin with a P, and neutron sounds like neutral, so it's easy to remember that charge. The one you really have to learn, sort of memorize, is electron with a negative charge. So carbon's going to have 2 electron shells or orbitals. These terms mean the same thing. I may use them interchangeably, so it's important that you're able to recognize what I'm talking about. So what I'm talking about when I say electron shell or orbital are these rings right here. So this one right here is our first orbital. And this first orbital is only going to take 2 electrons. Our second orbital, which is the outer ring, that one wants 8 electrons. And if we were to have a third orbital, that one would also like 8 electrons. But if we count how many electrons carbon has in its outer orbital, we see it only has 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're missing 1, 2, 3, 4 electrons that carbon would want. Now these electrons, because they are in the outer orbital or the outer shell, are what's called valence shell electrons. So if you hear the term valence shell, it's talking about the electrons and anything that exists in the outermost shell of an atom. We talked about carbon needing 4 bonds. Carbon has a relatively strong nucleus. That nucleus has 6 protons in it. And the strength of a nucleus is determined by how positive the nucleus is and how close the electrons are, because the positive charge is going to pull on those electrons. If we get a much larger element, even though it may have, 80 or 90 protons in the center, you also have to remember that those electrons are going to be getting further and further away from there. So the strength of a nucleus is not solely determined by how many protons, it's determined by how well those protons can pull on the electrons it has. So carbon being a small atom, those 6 protons can hang on to their 6 electrons pretty well. Carbon will bond in a huge variety of ways. Because it makes 4 bonds, it can make some really incredibly stable structures. And that is what gives us its ability to make macromolecules. Now macro just means large, so these are large molecules. The opposite of this would be micro. Think microscope, we look at small things. So macromolecules are going to be these giant molecules that use carbon as their backbone. And the reason carbon is able to do this because it can form those 4 bonds and those really stable structures, you can make large molecules. And it's one of the main reasons that carbon is essential to life. Here we just have a picture of the periodic table. If you are ever looking for carbon, it is right there, element number 6, and we have a zoom in on what it's going to look like on the periodic table over here. Here is carbon's name written out, and then we have its atomic number, which is 6, and the atomic number tells us the number of protons. The atomic number and the number of protons are what determines an element's identity. You can change the number of neutrons, you can change the number of electrons, but if you change the number of protons, you no longer have the same element. You've changed it. This is its symbol right here. It's either going to be 1 or 2 letters for all of the elements, but it will only be 1 capital letter. So if you ever are asked to count how many elements in a molecule or in a compound, you're basically looking for capital letters. And then down below we have the atomic mass. We find the atomic mass by adding the number of protons to the number of neutrons. In the case of carbon, we have 6 protons and we have 6 neutrons, which gives us a total of 12. But you'll notice we have these other numbers on the end, 0.011. Well, what that tells us is that carbon has isotopes. This is an average atomic mass. So that means that we know from looking at the previous video that carbon also has isotopes of carbon-13 and carbon-14. The fact that this is a very low number tells us that those do not occur in high amounts in nature. So they're very uncommon isotopes. Now we get into the octet rule. The octet rule, you may hear it at the beginning of the word oct, kind of reminds you of octagon, which is an 8-sided figure. So the octet rule is that all atoms want 8 electrons in their valence shell. Remember, the valence shell is going to be that outermost electron shell or orbital. The only exception to this that we'll be talking about extensively will be hydrogen, which fills the lowest level and only needs 2. Carbon wants to share electrons, not give them away. That has to do with the strength of the nucleus pulling on those electrons. Carbon is pretty fond of its electrons. It doesn't want to give them away, but it's okay sharing them. So over here we have a picture of CO2. Now we're all used to carbon dioxide getting sort of a bad rap as a greenhouse gas. It's not something we want to breathe in large amounts. It's not good for us. But carbon dioxide is actually responsible for all of life on Earth. Through a process called carbon fixation, plants and other autotrophs, which are things that make their own food, are able to take atmospheric CO2 and turn it into glucose, which is a sugar. Now, their ability to do that is what has made all life on Earth possible. So while carbon dioxide gets a bad rap for being a greenhouse gas, it's also responsible for all life on Earth. So we got to give it a little credit. So we see how carbon bonds with its 2 oxygens. If you see, the electrons for carbon are shown in the X's, and oxygen's electrons are shown with little dots. So they've drawn in all of carbon's electrons, including its lower orbitals of 2. But the section I want to look at most is right here. Now we can see that carbon is going to share 2 of its electrons with oxygen. So we get 2 X's and 2 little dots. What this would look like if I was going to draw a structural formula is I would draw, do it over here, 2 lines to represent the double bond or the 2 electrons that are being shared. So this would be the Bohr model of CO2, and this up here is our structural formula for CO2. The bond we were just looking at with CO2 is a covalent bond. We talked a lot about it sharing electrons, and that's what a covalent bond is. It's when elements, or atoms rather, share electrons. With covalent bonds, the nuclei of the atoms are strong enough that they want to hang on to their own electrons, but they still want to fulfill the octet. They still want 8 electrons in their outer shell. Covalent bonds will vary hugely in how strong they are. You will have some atoms that covalently bond and are incredibly stable. They don't react to stuff. They're very happy just hanging out with each other. And then you'll have others that are more reactive. The bonds aren't as strong. Almost all covalent bonds are stronger than ionic bonds, which is the next one we'll be talking about. So in case you're wondering how a covalent bond works, you see in these pictures, this is the same one we just looked at, the electrons are drawn as sort of being stuck in the same spot. But electrons are never stationary. They're always constantly moving. So while they show them stuck and sort of in this middle place between the 2 atoms, what it actually means to be bonded covalently is that electrons will flip-flop between the two atoms. So sometimes it'll be with carbon, sometimes it'll be with oxygen. But electrons can move so incredibly fast that the flip-flopping still keeps them stable. It doesn't, upset the bond between the two of them. So we have two types of covalent bonds. We have non-polar covalent, where the electrons are shared evenly. So there's no slight positive or negative. Carbon dioxide is an example of a non-polar covalent bond. There is a balance of charge all around the molecule. The classic example of a polar covalent would be water. Structural formula for water, H2O, which tells us we have two hydrogens, and there's an invisible one here which we don't draw in for the one oxygen. And we see right here this Mickey Mouse looking thing, that is our water molecule. So electrons are not shared evenly, resulting in a slight negative and positive end. So the reason that you would get a polar covalent bond is because you have an atom whose nucleus is much better at hogging electrons. In the case of water, H2O, oxygen has a lot more protons in its nucleus than hydrogen does. Hydrogen's a little wussy, it's only got one proton. So what that means is oxygen is going to pull on those electrons that are shared, and it's going to pull it towards its nucleus. And what will happen is, because you get a crowding of electrons around the oxygen, you're going to get a slight, this is the symbol for slight, negative charge on this end, and by default, because the electrons are moving away from this end, you get a slight positive charge over here. And this is a polar covalent bond. These are not full charges. It's not a full negative or a full positive. It's a slight charge, but it will still create some other bonds that we'll talk about later and is important. Last but not least, we have ionic bonds. So while covalent bonds are the sharing of electrons, ionic bonds are the transfer of electrons between atoms. It occurs between elements on the opposite side of the periodic table. So if you have your halogens, which are all the way on your right-hand side, not all the way to your noble gases, but just before, and then alkali metals, a lot of your groups on your left-hand side, those two groups tend to exchange electrons. And we'll look at why that is. So the classic example of an ionic bond is going to be sodium chloride, otherwise known as table salt. So if we look at down here, we have sodium in its atom or just regular Bohr model form, all by its lonesome. And we notice that sodium has this one electron in its valence shell, so just one valence shell electron. And chlorine over here has 7 in its valence shell. And we know from the octet rule that chlorine's going to want one more to get 8. But sodium actually just wants to get rid of that one electron in the outer shell. Because if it gets rid of it, if you look at the shell beneath it, it has 8 there. So now we sort of have a good situation setting up here. We have sodium, who desperately wants to give one away, and chlorine, who desperately wants to get an electron. Now, these elements, because they are so desperate to give away or get electrons, on their own are very reactive. Sodium, if you were to put it in water, actually explodes. And chlorine, in World War I, was actually weaponized to become a gas. So because if you breathe it in, it does a lot of damage to a lot of the tissues in your body. But when we put them together, we have sodium, who's going to give this electron to chlorine, and then they're both going to be happy. So if you look down here, once sodium gives that away, it's going to have a positive charge. Unlike polar covalent bonds, this is a full positive. So sodium has a +1 charge. Now chlorine just gained an electron, so it's going to have a -1 charge, again a full charge. So you might be thinking at this point, how is this a bond? Sodium basically just gave chlorine an electron, so why are they bonded together? Well, this has to do with sort of an important rule in chemistry, physics, biology, which is that opposites attract and like charges repel. So we now have opposite charges. We have positive sodium and negative chlorine. So now these two atoms are going to be attracted to each other because of their opposite charges, and that is what creates the bond between the two of them. So here's our wrap-up of everything we've gone over. We had carbon structure, electron shells, octet rule, covalent bonds, ionic bonds. You should be able to explain the importance of carbon and how its structure contributes to it, be able to identify valence shell electrons, explain the octet rule, differentiate between ionic and covalent bonds. Again, if you have any questions, please email me.